Hey everybody, this is the new ZFC. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about this new camera, and I'm also going to share my experiences of shooting with this over the past couple of weeks. We're going to be looking at the body, the design. I'm going to talk to you all about the little intricate details in this camera. We're also then going to look at the specifications. I've done some tests with autofocus, and I've also got some sample images that I can show you as well. Do keep in mind, this is a pre-production sample, so just keep that in mind when you look at the samples when it comes to autofocus, when it comes to video, and when it comes to the stills examples that I've got to show you as well. So let's get started with the camera body itself, the design. That's obviously why I think most of you are here, really. Quite clearly, the design of this camera is all about that heritage, old style film camera that Nikon have from their past film cameras. It also then lends from the newer design of things like the DF, and this is obviously then the mirrorless equivalent of that kind of older style design camera. So this is something that Nikon's done throughout the years. They did it in DSLRs with the DF. They've done it before, obviously, with film cameras. This isn't something that all of a sudden Nikon just haven't done before, but it is the first time they've done it with a mirrorless camera. So hence why it's a ZFC. The Z does mean that it is obviously Z mount. So it will take any Z mount lens. It will also use the FTZ adapter, so you can use the FTZ adapter on it if you wanted to as well. So when it comes to the dials on the top, these top plate dials are carved out of aluminium. So they are metal. They do feel really nice to adjust in the hand. Now, the ISO dial, first of all, on the left is locking. You can set that to 100, 200, all the way up to 51,000 ISO on the dial if you wanted to. And at each individual ISO, it will lock in place. As I say, you would always then have to push in the little locking dial to change the ISO. It will stop, and it has a hard stop at ISO 100, and it also has a hard stop at ISO H2 as well. So when it comes to shutter speed on the dial on the right hand side, the shutter speed dial is not locking. So it freely allows you to change shutter speed as and when you want to. It only locks in place if you set it to the third of a step option, and that will then mean that you can control the shutter speed using your rear control dial instead of using the shutter speed dial. So something to keep in mind. You'll then have next to that the shutter button, which will be in a very similar place to those of you that have used a Nikon DF or a Nikon film camera in the past. We then have the exposure compensation dial. So the very last dial is an exposure compensation dial. This obviously allows you to add exposure compensation if you want to. Again, as I mentioned, all three of those dials are made of aluminium, and they do feel actually really nice to use and easy to navigate as you're using the camera. So with a Z camera, I know pretty much that my rear dial does what I want it to do, the front dial does what I want it to do, and you can use the camera quickly. And you can still do that. You can set this camera up so that you are just using the front and rear dials, and you can be in auto ISO. But if you want to have that slower, creative, tactile approach, then that's where obviously these top plate dials come in for ISO, shutter speed, and exposure compensation. Also, along the top plate of the camera on the left-hand side, we have a mode selector, so you can switch between manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, P, and auto. So if you're in a hurry and for whatever reason you want to just switch that straight back to auto, or you want to switch it specifically to shutter priority or aperture priority, then you can do. Over towards the right-hand side, there's a switch underneath the shutter speed dial. This allows you to switch between stills and video. So one thing to keep in mind is that the older Nikon DF didn't have video. It was stills only. Nikon have decided that in this camera, they not only want to shoot stills, but they also want you to be able to shoot video. So this has the full setup of video options, the full video menu. You're not losing anything from the video side of things by using this camera. And I'll talk about the video options in a little bit more detail shortly. There's also a very small top plate display. Now this top plate display is mostly there to show you your aperture value. So it will show you if you're shooting at f2.8, 1.8, f0.95, or all the way up to f22 or wherever you want to be, depending on the lens that you're shooting. So there's a small top plate display to show your aperture value. And then next to that, we have our red record button. So as I mentioned, we still do have video in this camera, and we have a red record button to start and stop recording. Around the back of the camera, generally the button layout is fairly similar to previous cameras, playback, delete buttons, and then we also have a multi-directional pad, and then we also have menu buttons and so on. Now, the outer covering of the viewfinder is a circle, so it makes it appear as though the viewfinder is like a circular design. I like this, it makes it look quite nice, and it does mean that the viewfinder is raised quite far from the back of the camera. So those of you that shoot with glasses, for example, it means that you're not always banging your nose or your glasses into the back of the camera. So the viewfinder cover cap makes it look like a circular viewfinder, but also it actually makes the viewfinder experience quite nice as well. One of the things that is a first for a Z series camera is a fully articulating and rotating screen. So on Z series cameras, generally they've been flip out screens and they haven't been fully articulating screens. So generally on this camera, this screen will flip out all the way to the side. You can tilt that all the way down, and then you can tilt that all the way back round to face you as well if you wanted to. And the camera body itself is sealed, but not fully weather sealed. So generally across the top plate and the dials across the top, there's dust and drip resistance, but the actual camera, especially on the bottom of the camera, isn't completely sealed. It's very similar to the situation we have with the Z50. So there's a little bit of sealing, but it's nowhere near the same level of weather sealing that you would get in a D850 or a Z7 II, for example. So just be aware of that. The camera body is made of a magnesium alloy as well, so it's not like a complete plastic case. There is a lot of metal that's in this camera. There are some plastic switches and plastic dials. The battery door, for example, is a plastic battery door, but generally speaking, the body is really nicely put together. And as I mentioned, the dials at the top, the situation with the dials that you use most and the most top dials do feel really nice. So the materials that have been used are really nice materials as well. For those of you with slightly larger hands, or for those of you that are going to use this camera with a bigger lens, you can get a grip. I don't have one here to show you, but I do have a picture of it, so you'll be able to see what that grip looks like on the front of the camera. And that just obviously adds a little bit more of a grip to the front of the camera for control if you wanted to. Okay, other than that, design of the camera kind of speaks for itself, and hopefully you've seen some of those close-up detail shots that I've been rolling as well to give you an idea of the quality of this camera. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the specifications of this camera. So first of all, the big one, this is a DX size sensor. So it is a 20 megapixel DX size sensor. This is not a full frame camera. The ISO range of 100 up to 51,000. You also have the ability to shoot up to 11 frames per second with full autofocus and auto exposure if you wanted to. It does have one single card slot, which is just an SD card slot, and it has 209 focusing points. So on paper, there's a lot of things that sound similar to a Z50, especially if you compare their specifications side by side, same megapixels and so on. But there have been a lot of improvements when it comes to software and a lot of features that have been added to this camera that the Z50 does not have. And also, obviously, the biggest difference is that exterior design. The Z50 just doesn't look anything like this. The other really useful feature for me is that this camera has a USB-C connection to it. That means with USB-C, you can power the camera and have the camera turned on at the same time. So even if the camera's on, the battery will still charge as long as you're using a USB-C cable and the correct USB-C plug as well. This ZFC will be available in a magnitude of different kits. So there'll be a kit with the 16 to 50, which is the DX lens. There'll also be a kit with the new 28mm f2.8. That is a full frame lens, but it is very small and very compact, and it works fantastically well on the ZFC. I've not got one to show you physically, but I can put a picture up here so you can see what it looks like. I have shot with that 28mm, and I'll let you into a little bit of information before I make a full video on it. I really like the 28mm prime. So I think that'd actually be one of my most used personal lenses. So when I'm just shooting for myself, that 28mm, I really like the quality of it, the size, the weight of it. I'm really happy with it. I will be doing some separate stuff around that 28mm as soon as I can, but I just don't have one of the special edition 28mm to show you in this video. There will also be a vlogging kit that you'll be able to buy. I don't know when this kit will be available, and it will depend upon your region. So there might be certain regions that won't have this vlogging kit, but that will include a specific tripod handle grip that is made by Small Rig. That also includes a Bluetooth remote that allows you to control the camera from that grip as well. Also includes a Sennheiser microphone. So I'm not sure about regions on that, but there is definitely this vlogging kit that you can see in here that puts together kind of all the bits that you would need to, start recording videos with it. I've also tried the ZFC with a lot of other Z mount lenses. So the 50mm f2.8 macro works fantastically well on this camera. A great lens because it's small, lightweight. The 50mm 1.8, you guys know I love that 50mm 1.8, so I've used that on here as well. And also the 24-200 works fantastically well on this camera as well. So lots of different Z mount lenses that you can use on this. I think one of the biggest benefits is the fact that it has a Z mount. So you are then able to use all of the Z mount lenses. I appreciate that most of them are full frame, but I kind of see that as an advantage, especially for those of you that already have a Z mount camera, because you can use your existing full frame Z mount lenses. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to show you some of the samples that I've shot with this camera, and I've used a number of different lenses, so keep an eye on the camera settings and the lens information that will be in the top corner. But I'm going to roll some of the sample images just to give you an idea of the types of shots that you can easily shoot with this camera. Nothing special, just I went out for a couple of days, just took the camera with me just to see what types of images I could get. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the autofocusing tests that I've done. Now, I've done a couple of tests around vlogging with this camera, so holding the camera in front of you and seeing if it keeps you in focus at arm's length. And then I've done a couple of tests around just general eye tracking, focusing, and so on. I always do that because I know that you guys love me just running around in front of my camera like a complete idiot. So we'll take a look at some of those tests. Now, what I will say is I was blown away. What I was expecting from this was a level of autofocus that was similar to Z50. And the autofocus performance of this camera is incredibly good. It appears that it has all of the updates that were made available to like Z6 II and Z7 II. So it can do face and eye tracking in wide area large. It can also track eyes from a much further distance, and it also keeps the focus in box on your subject much tighter. So it basically sticks to your subject much better than the Z50 does, for example. So the autofocus in this camera has been massively improved beyond what you would get in a normal Z50, for example. There are a couple of things that this camera can do that the Z50 can't do when it comes to autofocus. Like I mentioned, eye and face detect in wide area large, and also it can do animal eye and face detect in video. When it comes to eye autofocus, I was really impressed. I'll show you the examples. Also, do keep in mind that this is very early software, so I'm not even showing you final firmware. And the results that I got were amazing. Now obviously I'm going to do more testing around this autofocus performance. I'd actually be really keen to test this against like a Z6 II, because I think this is actually secretly really good. So I'd be really keen to test this against a Z6 II from an autofocusing performance as soon as I get a production unit, but I've been really happy with what I've seen so far, even not being final firmware. Okay, so when it comes to video in this camera, the video specifications of this camera are very similar to what we've seen in a lot of other Nikon Z mount cameras. So we have the ability to shoot in 4K, we have the ability to shoot in 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you want to, 24 frames per second as well. And then if you drop down to full HD, so 1080p, you can then shoot at 120 frames per second or 100 frames per second, 60, 50, 25, 24, and so on. So frame size and resolution, nothing major there, but the fact is that this camera actually has video, and it's a really good 4K quality video. You're not in a situation where it doesn't have video at all, or you're not sacrificing on the video side of things. This camera is just as good of a stills camera as it is for a video camera, so it does both just as well. You're not taking a sacrifice on one side, and you can still use the dials to adjust your settings in video if you wanted to. Just be aware that the dials obviously make a clicky noise. So it depends on what you're shooting, and if you wanted to change your settings while shooting, that might cause you a problem. So just be aware. Of that clicking. When you're recording in 4K at 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second, there is no crop that's applied to the 4K, so you are using the full width of the sensor. It is obviously at a 16:9, but you don't have to apply any cropping or anything like that. There is obviously a mic input on the left-hand side, but there is not a headphone jack. One of the things that I've not been able to test and unsure about is if you could use a USB-C set of headphones, but I don't think that is the case, but that's not something that I've checked yet, but I wouldn't expect that to be the case. A couple of other things to keep in mind, a couple of other changes to keep in mind as well. So this is the first Z camera, and it's actually the first digital DSLR that I've seen in a long time that has a 3x3 framing grid. That's something that a lot of you have been asking for. That's something that I've been asking for a long time. Originally, normally Z series cameras have a 4x4 framing grid, and a lot of people like the idea of a 3x3 because of rule of thirds. So the fact that this finally has a 3x3 framing grid, it sounds really stupid and really not something that's going to make a huge difference. But to me, a 3x3 framing grid is something that a lot of people ask for day in, day out, especially when I'm talking to either people learning about composition, or if I'm talking to people learning about their cameras and they want to know if they have different framing grids. In every other Z camera, you don't have access to a 3x3. It also has all the other features that you would expect to find in a Nikon Z camera. So it has interval timer shooting, time lapse, and it also has focus shift shooting for focus stacking. It does not stack in camera, but it allows you to start the stack, and it allows you to automatically program in your camera to change the focus position. So focus stacking technically is built into this camera. It just doesn't stack in camera. When the screen is flipped out, it automatically enables self-portrait mode. This deactivates all the other buttons other than the shutter button or other than the video record button. Now, you can turn that off because you might want to be able to change settings whilst you're recording yourself with the screen flipped out, for example. So just keep in mind that there is technically a self-portrait mode that can be turned on or off. This camera also has extended shutter speeds. So just like the Z6 II and the Z7 II, we can now start shooting all the way up to 900 seconds. So you can select from 60, 120, all the way up to 600, 900 seconds. Obviously you can't do that from the top plate dial, but you will be able to change that when you're in manual mode with your rear dial. Now, one of the key differences you'll find in this camera when it comes comparing it against other Z mount cameras is that the ISO cannot be changed in the camera's menu system. So you have an ISO dial, and you can obviously choose the ISO value on that dial. But if you go into the photo shooting menu and you go to ISO sensitivity settings, your ISO sensitivity cannot be set in that menu. Every other Nikon camera will allow you to do that. The only thing you would need to do in the menu is use it for auto ISO. And that is obviously something that you cannot do from the dial. You have to turn auto ISO on or off in the menu. So for some of you that might be a problem, but for most of you, you're obviously happy changing the ISO on the dial yourself. Okay, so overall, I was actually really impressed with this camera. I did have a couple of reservations when I first saw it about the design and about the use of the camera, but the more that I've used it, it's really grown on me, and I really do like it at this point, genuinely. Obviously, it's not going to replace a Z6 II, it's not going to replace a Z7 II, but it's not designed for that. I think it's either designed as your first camera, your kind of main camera if you don't already have a full frame camera. It's also designed for your main camera if you really like the design and really like the idea of using these dials. But also I think there's a lot of people out there who already have a main full frame Z camera, like a Z6 II, a Z7 II, and this is designed to be like your weekend camera. This is designed to be like your own personal camera that you use when you're not working for clients, or that you use when you're out and about and you don't want to take your bigger full frame camera. So this for me is like that kind of experience camera where you want to slow yourself down, you want to be a little bit more interactive with the photography that you're taking and so on. So I do think there's lots of different people that this appeals to. Yes, it's not a Z9, but it is actually a pretty impressive camera for what it is. As I mentioned as well, there's a lot of people who I think will compare this just on a spec by spec basis against the Z50, and I would deem that to be unfair. The changes that I've seen, the differences that I've seen, especially when it comes to autofocus, means that this is quite a substantial step above Z50. If you were comparing the two and autofocus was an important thing for you and you like the design, then this is kind of a no-brainer over the Z50. The Z50 obviously still has the advantage of having that simpler design, the bigger grip, for example. That's where you might want to look at a Z50, but from an autofocus and design point of view, this camera is definitely a big step up. Some of you would also want the different style of screen as opposed to the Z50 as well. I would love to see a full frame version. I know that a lot of you guys would also probably love to see a full frame version. And it'd be great to see that there would be kind of like a range of ZF cameras. There could be a range of ZF-C cameras and then a range of ZF cameras that would be full frame cameras. I honestly have no idea if that's the plan or whatever it is they're going to do, but it would be really nice that if this camera does well, if a lot of people like this camera, that then there will be a full frame equivalent that has that kind of style of design, but with a full frame sensor in it, either the sensor from a Z6 II or the sensor from a Z7 II, for example. I think that would also be a camera that a lot of people are really interested in as well. Obviously, this is a pre-production unit, so as soon as I get a production unit, let me know in the comments what types of things would you want to know? What types of things do you want me to test? Do you want me to do a direct comparison against the Z50 from an autofocusing point of view? Do you want me to do a direct comparison against the Z6 II, maybe, from an autofocusing point of view? What comparisons do you want to see? What do you want to know about this camera? Let me know in the comments below. I'll get back to as many of you as I can. There's lots of stuff that I want to try and compare or test or take a look at this camera, but I do think that for some of you, you'll probably end up buying it from what you've seen in this video anyway, purely because of the design, and as I've mentioned about the performance of it, I was really surprised by how good it is. If you have any questions about the Nikon Z F-C, if there's anything that you want to know that I've not talked about, if there's anything that you want to ask me about this camera, then do let me know in the comments below. I hope that if you find this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up. Likes really help videos on YouTube, and the past couple of videos I've done where I've asked for you guys to like the video, you've done that in literally thousands. So thank you so much for that support. So if you found this video useful, the easiest way to support me would just be to give my video a like, and that means that YouTube will then share that with more people. So please do give it a thumbs up. If you've got any questions, do ask them below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.